Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are journeying way, way back in time, tens of thousands of years ago, um, to pull back the curtain on a fascinating corner of the prehistoric world.
Yeah, a really deep dive this time.
Definitely. We've gathered a stack of sources for you, articles, research papers, even some historical accounts, all focusing on two incredible windows into the ancient past.
Which are,
The stunning art left behind in deep caves, and one of the most imposing creatures that walked alongside early humans, the mighty and now extinct cave bear.
that's right. And these sources, well, they take us all the way from the artistic expressions found on those cave walls, right down to the nitty-gritty scientific analysis of ancient bones.
Revealing secrets about diet, lifestyle.
Even how this powerful animal met its end. It's quite a story locked in those bones and paintings.
So our mission here is to unpack all of this for you. We really want to extract the most important insights from these sources, get a handle on what they tell us about the connections between early human creativity, their environment.
And the ancient megafauna they shared the planet with.
Yeah.
And, you know, as often happens when you dig deep, we might even challenge some long-held beliefs along the way about both the art and the bears themselves.
Think of it as, well, a journey into the deep past. We'll explore how early humans perceived and interacted with their world and the remarkable creatures that inhabited it.
And also how modern science, with its new tools and perspectives, is constantly uncovering surprising details that reshape our understanding of this distant era.
It really keeps changing, doesn't it?
It does. Okay, let's unpack this by first exploring the canvas itself. Those incredible prehistoric cave paintings, they give us such a vivid, almost personal window into this time.
Right. These works of art are incredibly ancient. We're talking dating back deep into the early prehistoric period, specifically the Paleolithic age.
That's the old Stone Age, basically.
Yeah, the Old Stone Age, stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. And while you find examples dotted around the globe, the vast majority of the really famous, spectacular sites are concentrated in just two countries in Europe, France and Spain.
France and Spain, exactly. That's where the mother lode seems to be.
And we're not just talking about a few isolated spots here and there. Across these regions, the sources mention roughly 400 discovered sites containing this ancient artwork.
400. That's a significant body of work preserved over millennia, isn't it?
It truly is. And this work, it's primarily attributed to Homo sapiens, right? Our direct ancestors.
Largely, yes. Our ancestors who began to spread across Europe during this period.
So we're looking at the creative output of early modern humans.
Pretty much. I mean, there's ongoing, really fascinating research into whether Neanderthals created earlier, maybe simpler, forms of art or symbolic expression. But the iconic painted caves, the ones you usually picture.
Like Lascaux.
Exactly. Those are generally linked to these early modern human populations, especially during the Upper Paleolithic period.
And speaking of iconic cave art, Lascaux Cave in France. That name immediately comes to mind. It's probably the most famous example, the one that really brought prehistoric cave art into the, global consciousness.
Absolutely. The story of Lascaux is quite remarkable in itself. It was discovered relatively recently, 1940.
Just before the war really kicked off.
Right. And quite serendipitously, by 4 young French boys looking for their dog. Apparently, the dog fell down a hole.
No way!
Yeah, they followed the dog into this hole, and suddenly they were standing in an underground gallery covered in masterpieces from 17,000 years ago.
Imagine that moment, just stumbling upon this lost world. So after the Second World War, with peace restored, the cave was opened up to the public.
It was, and it became incredibly popular, drawing just enormous crowds.
How enormous are we talking?
Enormous is an understatement. At its peak, the sources say they were seeing around 1,500 visitors a day going into the cave.
Wow. That's a lot of people breathing in a confined space.
Exactly. And this is where the unintended consequences of human curiosity became starkly apparent. The sheer volume of people brought huge amounts of carbon dioxide from their breath into that delicate, stable cave environment.
And that started causing problems.
Big problems. The change in the atmosphere, plus other stuff like heat and humidity from all those bodies, it began to severely damage the incredibly fragile prehistoric paintings and engravings. Molds started to grow, pigments were affected. It was becoming a real disaster.
It's that classic unfortunate case, isn't it? Our desire to see and experience history directly having a, detrimental impact on it.
Absolutely. Because the damage was becoming so severe, Lascaux was closed permanently to the public in 1963, just shut down to try and halt the deterioration and preserve the art.
So you can't go in the original cave anymore.
Not unless you're a researcher under very strict conditions.
Hmm.
Today, it's recognized as a UNESCO protected site, and access is extremely restricted.
Thankfully, they've built those replicas, right? Lascaux II and Lascaux IV.
Yes, magnificent replicas which allow visitors to experience the scale and beauty of the art without ever setting foot in the original cave. It's a compromise, but necessary to protect the real thing.
So looking at the art inside Lascaux, even in the replicas, what do we see?
Oh, it's truly breathtaking. The sources detail about 600 paintings, give or take,
600 paintings.
and around 1,400 similar engravings within the whole cave complex. The paintings are overwhelmingly of animals, depicted with incredible vitality and skill. Horses are particularly notable. They dominate many of the most famous scenes, often portrayed with real dynamic movement.
And the dating for Lascaux, it puts it around.
Approximately 17,000 to 15,000 BC. So yeah, deep in the Ice Age. Just thinking about who created this. In the dark, deep underground, all those millennia ago, it's astonishing.
It really is. And the techniques they use, you mentioned they're surprisingly sophisticated.
For the time, yes.
Yeah.
The common colors you see are mainly red and black, earth tones.
How on earth did they produce pigments that would last, 17,000 years?
Well, they used natural mineral pigments sourced from their environment. The vibrant reds came from iron oxides, materials like hematite.
Basically rust.
Basically rust, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Ground up. For the blacks, they used manganese dioxide, another mineral, or just plain charcoal from burnt wood.
Yeah.
And these mineral powders would then be ground up really fine and mixed with a binding agent, often just water or maybe animal fats, to create a paste or a liquid paint, something they could apply to the uneven cave walls.
So they were essentially prehistoric artists with a palette of earthy pigments using what was available right around them. And it wasn't just applying paint, you mentioned engravings too.
Yes, the sources point out that alongside the paintings, some caves also contain sculptures molded from clay or basic engravings scratched or carved right into the rock surfaces. It shows a range of artistic expression beyond just, slapping paint on a wall.
Now, moving from the how to the what exactly were they depicting on these cave walls? What subjects were important enough to warrant all this effort and, well, preservation?
Early on, one of the most common subjects you find in Paleolithic art sites, particularly in the earlier phases, are handprints.
Handprints.
Yeah, often negative images. Created by placing a hand against the wall and blowing pigment around it, probably through a reed or bone tube, creates a stencil effect.
That feels incredibly personal, doesn't it? Like a direct connection across time, an ancient signature saying, I was here.
It absolutely does. You see that handprint, and suddenly the vastness of time just shrinks.
Mhm.
As time went on, though, the subjects evolved. Later art commonly depicted animals, often captured in really dynamic poses or integrated into what looked like hunting scenes.
Okay.
There are also figures interpreted as shamans, maybe, or representations of other traditions or cultural elements. But what's striking is the relative scarcity of full representations of the human form compared to how detailed the animal depictions are.
The focus was clearly intensely on the animal world. And the types of animals they depicted also changed over time, didn't they? Reflecting the changing environment around them.
Precisely. Earlier art included animals that were prevalent at the time but later became less common or even extinct, things like mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses,
Oh.
and significantly for our conversation today, cave bears.
Ah, yes. The cave bear makes an appearance in the art.
It does, in some of the earlier stuff. Then, as the climate shifted through the ice ages and the European landscape changed, the animals depicted in the art also changed. Later cave art, like much of what you find in Lascaux, and other sites like Neo, featured animals that were more abundant in those periods.
Gotcha.
Horses, bison, aurochs, those are the wild ancestors of domestic cattle. Various cervids like deer and reindeer and ibex, a type of wild goat often found in mountainous areas.
So the art isn't just static decoration. It provides a kind of living record reflecting the fauna that were important to these people, maybe for food, maybe for spiritual reasons, maybe both.
It offers a window into the ecosystem they were part of and the creatures they encountered day to day or perhaps revered.
Which brings us to a really fundamental question that has puzzled archaeologists and historians for centuries. Why? Why did early humans expend so much energy to go into these deep, dark, often quite inaccessible parts of caves, sometimes squeezing through tight passages? Why did they do that to create this art? What was the motive behind it all?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Historians have proposed several primary theories based on the sources we have. One prominent idea is that the art had a religious or symbolic function.
Okay.
The caves themselves, these deep, dark chambers, they might have been seen as sacred spaces, maybe thresholds to another world. The art could have been part of rituals, maybe a way of communicating with the spiritual world, or leaving powerful symbolic marks on these natural shelters.
Like going into a natural cathedral and leaving offerings or prayers on the walls, that kind of idea.
Potentially, yeah. Another theory is that it was a form of storytelling, or maybe a way to share crucial cultural knowledge.
Like teaching.
Perhaps the art was used to teach younger generations about animal behavior, maybe hunting techniques, or to illustrate myths and traditions important to the group. It's even possible it served as a way to entertain or occupy time during long periods spent sheltering the caves, especially during harsh Ice Age winters.
The detailed hunting scenes would certainly fit the storytelling or educational idea, showing how to track or maybe take down certain animals, and depicting the power and spirit of the animals could be part of that teaching too.
Definitely. And the handprints, those earliest personal marks, you could interpret them in various ways within these theories.
Yeah.
Perhaps a way of claiming space, signing a work, or maybe a personal connection to the power or spirits of the cave itself.
It's fascinating to think about the depth of meaning potentially encoded in these ancient images. What aspect of these theories or the art itself stands out most to you thinking about why they did it?
Well, what's really fascinating here is the level of skill and effort involved. Creating these pigments, finding suitable walls, sometimes even building rudimentary scaffolding to reach high places, it wasn't trivial, you know.
Right, it took serious work.
The sophistication of some of the drawings and paintings suggests a significant cultural investment. This complexity points away from just simple doodles or, like, idle pastime. It suggests something with deeper meaning, whether that meaning was religious, educational, social, or maybe a combination of all three. It tells us these were people with rich inner lives and complex cultures.
It definitely feels like something profound was happening in those deep, dark places. And you mentioned that one of the animals depicted in some of the earlier art was the cave bear.
Yes.
This is where our deep dive gets even more specific, doesn't it? Moving from the artist to one of their most impressive subjects, let's transition now and introduce this giant creature that shared the Pleistocene world with early humans.
Right. The animal we're focusing on now is the extinct cave bear, scientifically known as Ursus spelaeus. It's a member of the bear family, Ursidae, just like modern brown bears or polar bears, part of that group.
Tell us a bit about its place in the bear family tree. Where does it come from? How does it relate to bears today?
Okay, so both the cave bear and its closest living relatives, the brown bear, Ursus arctos, and the polar bear, Ursus maritimus, are thought to be descended from an earlier, now extinct bear. This ancestor was called the Etruscan bear, Ursus etruscus.
Etruscan bear. Never heard of that one.
It lived much earlier, from about 5.3 million years ago up until roughly 100,000 years ago. So a long-lived species itself.
And when did the cave bear lineage specifically branch off from the line leading to brown and polar bears?
The estimates suggest the last common ancestor that cave bears shared with the brown bear, polar bear lineage lived somewhere between 1.2 and 1.4 million years ago. So quite a long time back.
Okay.
During the Middle Pleistocene, that's the period before the Late Pleistocene when cave bears were most common, the lineage leading specifically to the cave bear is assigned to a species known as Ursus deningeri, or Denninger's bear.
Denninger's bear.
Yeah, another large bear that had a wide range found across Europe and stretching all the way to China.
So Ursus deningeri is essentially the immediate predecessor to Ursus spelaeus, the cave bear we're talking about.
Yes, that's generally the view. The transition between Ursus deningeri and Ursus spelaeus is usually placed around the last interglacial period that's a warmer period between major ice ages, roughly between 130,000 and 115,000 years ago.
So it wasn't like a sudden switch.
No, the boundary can be a bit arbitrary because it seems to have been a gradual process, a slow evolution. Some researchers even consider them just chronological variants of the same evolving species line. It really highlights how evolution is often a slow, continuous process rather than abrupt jumps between species.
Got it. A gradual transition from Denninger's bear to the cave bear. And what did this later bear, Ursus spelaeus, actually look like? What was its physical presence like for the humans encountering it back then?
It was a large and truly imposing animal, a real giant of the Ice Age. From skull fragments, we know the skull was very broad and domed, with a distinctive steep forehead quite different from the flatter profile of a brown bear skull.
Okay, a high forehead.
Right. And the body was stout, heavily built, with long thighs, massive shins, and feet that tended to turn inward slightly. In terms of overall skeletal structure, it was similar to a brown bear, but often considerably larger and more robust.
How large are we really talking? Were they bigger than the biggest brown bears we know today, like Kodiaks?
Yes, cave bears were comparable in size to, or even larger than, the largest modern bears. They could measure up to 2 meters in length.
That's about 6.6 feet.
From nose to tail, maybe even more for large males.
Okay, standing up, that would be quite a sight. And weight, what are the estimates there?
Average weights for males were substantial, estimated at 350 to 600 kilograms.
Whoa! 600 kilos, that's roughly 770 to 1,320 pounds. Huge.
Huge. Females were smaller, as is common in bears, but still very large animals. They likely weigh between 225 and 250 kilograms, so about 495 to 550 pounds.
Still a massive animal, even for a female. You mentioned a historical misconception about their size and museum skeletons in the notes.
Yes, this is a good example of how initial interpretations can sometimes be influenced by assumptions. For a long time, museum collections of cave bear skeletons showed a really striking disparity. Something like 90% of the specimens were classified as male.
90%. Why?
Well, it turns out the smaller female skeletons were mistakenly viewed as dwarfs, or somehow abnormal, rather than simply recognizing the significant sexual dimorphism, the difference in size between males and females, which is common in many mammal species, including bears. They just assumed the big ones were normal males and the smaller ones were runts.
Ah, so they were mistaking average female size for dwarfism. That makes sense once you factor in sexual dimorphism.
Precisely. And interestingly, their size wasn't static throughout their history either. The sources suggest they actually grew larger during glacial periods, the cold snaps.
An adaptation to the cold.
Likely, yeah. A larger body volume relative to surface area helps conserve heat more effectively. They tended to be a bit smaller during the warmer interglacial periods. Makes sense physiologically.
Did they have any other unique physical features? Maybe something related to how they processed food? You hinted at their teeth being important.
Yes, their teeth had quite unique features, and these became really central in the long debates about their diet. Compared to other bears, they lacked the usual 2 or even 3 small premolars that you see in the front of the tooth row in modern bears.
Fewer teeth overall, then.
Fewer premolars, yes. But to compensate for this loss, their last molar tooth, the big grinding tooth at the back, was very elongated and had supplementary cusps.
Extra bumps on the chewing surface.
Exactly, extra bumps and ridges. This morphological change, known as molarization, effectively increased their chewing capacity and the surface area for grinding. This unique dental setup, especially that enlarged, complex last molar, was long thought to be a key indicator of what they primarily ate.
Okay, let's dive into that diet then, because as you hinted, this seems to be an area where scientific understanding has really evolved, creating quite a puzzle over the years.
It absolutely has. It's been a long-standing debate in paleontology. The initial clues about their diet came from looking closely at those large, complex molars we just discussed. They often showed greater wear compared to the teeth of modern bears.
More worn down.
Yeah, which initially suggested they were processing tough, abrasive materials. And those morphological features we mentioned, the loss of premolars and that enhanced molarization at the back, were long interpreted as indicating a higher degree of herbivory, plant eating, than you see in the typically omnivorous brown bear.
So just looking at the teeth, did they initially think these giant bears were strictly vegetarian? Like giant pandas, but bears?
Based on the tooth morphology alone, yes, a solely vegetarian diet was widely inferred in the early days of research. And this view seemed to be strongly supported by stable isotope analysis of their fossilized bones.
Stable isotopes. Remind us how that works again.
Right, stable isotopes are variants of elements like nitrogen and carbon. They don't decay radioactively, and they accumulate differently in an animal's bones depending on what that animal eats. Carnivores tend to have higher levels of certain isotopes, like nitrogen-15, compared to herbivores, because those isotopes get concentrated as you move up the food chain.
Okay. And what did the isotopes show for cave bears?
Cave bear bones consistently showed low levels of both nitrogen-15 and carbon-13. These low levels are characteristic of a diet dominated by plants.
So for a significant time, the prevailing opinion, backed by both the tooth structure and the bone chemistry, was that the cave bear, despite its massive size, was primarily a vegetarian, maybe even more strictly herbivorous than any living bear species.
That was indeed the consensus based on that initial evidence. It seemed pretty clear-cut for a while. However, as is often the case in science, increasing amounts of counter-evidence began to emerge over the years, pointing towards a potentially more omnivorous diet.
What kind of evidence started to challenge that strict vegetarian view? What didn't quite fit?
Well, some researchers began to look more closely at regional variability in the stable isotopes. They found that the isotope values weren't completely uniform across the cave bear's vast European range,
Meaning?
meaning it suggested that their diet might have had some plasticity, some flexibility. Maybe it varied regionally or seasonally, rather than being rigidly vegetarian everywhere all the time. Also, a more recent comprehensive reevaluation of their craniodental morphology.
Looking at the skull and teeth shapes again?
Exactly. But this time comparing them systematically to a wide range of modern bears with known diets. This reevaluation actually placed the cave bear among omnivorous modern bear species in terms of those overall skull and tooth shapes.
Huh. So the skull and tooth shapes weren't only specialized for grinding plants after all when you looked closer.
That was the conclusion of that particular reevaluation, yes.
Yeah.
Furthermore, some later stable isotope studies looking very specifically at certain sites found higher and more variable delta 15N values compared to the known herbivores found at the same location,
Higher nitrogen 15. Suggesting.
suggesting a certain level of meat consumption, at least at those specific sites or perhaps during particular times of the year. Maybe scavenging, maybe opportunistic hunting.
This really sounds like a dietary puzzle with conflicting pieces of evidence. You've got teeth suggesting plants, isotopes mostly suggesting plants but with some variability, and then skull shape maybe suggesting omnivory.
Right.
Is there a more advanced scientific technique that could provide a clearer picture? Something more direct?
Yes, this is where a powerful, more recent technique comes in, and it's detailed in our sources. Dental microwear texture analysis, or DMTA. It gives us a much more nuanced look at the texture of the food they were eating, probably in the days or weeks right before they died.
Okay, let's unpack this. DMTA.
Yeah.
How does that work? What's it measuring?
Think of it like forensic analysis on their teeth, but at a microscopic level.
Mm.
When an animal chews, the food particles leave microscopic scratches, pits, and other features on the surface of the tooth enamel.
Tiny wear and tear.
Exactly. And the pattern and texture of these microwear features reflect the physical properties of the food being consumed. Eating hard, brittle things like bone or maybe hard nuts leaves different patterns than chewing tough, fibrous materials like leaves or muscle fiber.
I see.
DMTA uses advanced microscopy, like a confocal microscope, and specialized software to scan the 3D texture of the tooth surface and analyze these patterns quantitatively, measuring things like roughness, complexity, the directionality of scratches.
So by looking at these tiny wear patterns, you can tell something about how hard or tough their last meals were.
Exactly. And the key approach is to compare the microwear textures found on the teeth of extinct animals, like our Ursus spelaeus, to those of modern animals whose diets we know really well.
Then for the cave bear, they compared them to a range of modern bears with different known diets.
Yes, a key DMTA study detailed in the sources did exactly that. They compared Ursus spelaeus microwear textures to a diverse group of living bears. This included the giant panda,
The bamboo specialist.
right, almost exclusively herbivorous. Then sun bears, spectacled bears, and American black bears, which are generally considered omnivores with diets that vary a lot seasonally. Brown bears, classic omnivores with really diverse diets. And crucially, polar bears.
The hypercarnivore. Mostly seals, blubber, bone.
Exactly. Polar bears are hypercarnivorous, meaning their diet is almost entirely animal matter, including a lot of meat and bone crushing. So you've got the full spectrum represented.
That provides a great comparative baseline. So what did that comparison reveal about the cave bear's microwear? What did their teeth look like under the microscope?
The findings were quite significant and really helped clarify the diet debate. The study looked at metrics like complexity, which essentially measures how rough and irregular the tooth surface is. High complexity is often associated with eating hard, brittle things like bone or hard seeds.
Okay.
They also looked at anisotropy, which measures how oriented the wear features are, like if the scratches mostly go in the same direction. High anisotropy can indicate processing tough, fibrous material like leaves or maybe muscle.
Got it. Complexity for hardness, anisotropy for toughness. Hit me with the key results from the cave bear comparison.
Okay, first off, the polar bears. Being hypercarnivores and chewing on brittle bone, they had significantly higher complexity values than all the other modern bears examined.
Makes sense. Crushing bone creates a very rough, complex surface.
Exactly. Now, where did the cave bear fall on that complexity scale?
This is the key question.
Crucially, Ursus spelaeus had a mean complexity value significantly lower than the polar bears.
Lower than polar bears.
Much lower. This finding is very important because it strongly indicates that the cave bear was definitely not a hyper-scavenger or hyper-carnivore consuming large amounts of brittle bone, like some earlier ideas based on less detailed analysis might have suggested.
Okay, so rule out the idea of them being primarily bone crushers. How did their microwear complexity compare to the other bears than the omnivores and the panda?
This is where it gets really interesting and maybe a bit surprising. The study found that Ursus spelaeus microwear textures were statistically indistinguishable in terms of complexity and another measure called textural fill volume from all the other modern bears examined.
Indistinguishable from brown bears, black bears, sun bears, spectacled bears, and even the giant panda.
Yes, their complexity values fell right within the range of all those other bears.
Yeah.
Now looking at anisotropy, the measure of toughness,
Yeah.
Ursus spelaeus had significantly greater anisotropy than polar bears, which makes sense if they weren't eating as much brittle stuff. But again, their anisotropy values were indistinguishable from the other omnivorous or herbivorous species like brown bears or pandas.
So their teeth show wear patterns consistent with a diet that had a similar range of hardness and toughness textures to bears that eat a mix of plants and animals, or even predominantly tough plants like bamboo.
That's the interpretation coming directly from the DMTA data. Their microwear textures suggest a diet with a diversity of textural properties, falling squarely within the range of most other Ursus species living today, and clearly distinct from the extreme wear you see in a hypercarnivore like the polar bear.
Did they compare them to any other extinct animals using this method just to get another angle?
Yes, the study also compared Ursus spelaeus to the North American giant short-faced bear, Arctodus simus.
Ah, another massive extinct bear. Its diet was also debated for a long time, wasn't it? Often thought to be a super scavenger or predator.
Exactly, though recent work is challenging that view too. But comparing the two extinct giants was interesting.
And how did the cave bear's microwear stack up against Arctodus?
Arctodus simus had similar complexity values to Ursus spelaeus, so neither seemed to be primarily eating brittle bone based on this. However, Ursus spelaeus had significantly higher anisotropy than Arctodus simus.
Higher anisotropy, meaning the cave bear's food was tougher.
That specific difference suggests that Ursus spelaeus likely processed tougher food items, perhaps things like tough grasses or substantial amounts of leaves, more so than Arctodus simus did.
How does that fit with the isotope data?
Well, combined with the isotopic data that consistently points towards significant plant consumption, this reinforces the idea that while they were likely omnivorous, a major component of their diet was plant matter, and potentially quite tough or low-quality vegetation, the kind you might find in environments like high alpine meadows, maybe.
Okay, so pulling all the DMTA findings together, what's the big conclusion about the cave bear's diet based on this advanced analysis?
The DMTA strongly supports the conclusion that Ursus spelaeus was not a hyperscavenger or hypercarnivore. That seems pretty clear now. Its diet was almost certainly omnivorous, which is consistent with the more recent interpretations of isotopic data that showed some variability.
But leaning heavily towards plants.
Yes, vegetation was likely the primary component, maybe even specialized on processing tough, low-quality plant material, perhaps the kind prevalent in those high alpine environments where many remains are found. But they weren't exclusively vegetarian.
And you mentioned that some earlier, maybe simpler 2D microwear studies had suggested they ate more bone than brown bears. How is that reconciled with this 3D DMTA finding that they weren't bone crushers like polar bears?
Right, that's a good point. The researchers who conducted the DMTA explained that this discrepancy is likely due to methodological differences.
Yeah.
Earlier studies using 2D methods often just counted features like pits and scratches visible on a 2D image.
Okay.
3D texture analysis, the DMTA method, captures much more nuanced information about the entire wear surface topography. For instance, they point out that in carnivores, eating more bone might actually lead to larger individual pits, but maybe fewer total pits compared to eating less bone but more frequently. This could confuse simple 2D counting methods. The 3D analysis is considered more robust for inferring the actual mechanical properties of the food being eaten.
It sounds like even with DMTA, pinpointing exact percentages of plants versus animals is still tricky, though. Can they say like 80% plants, 20% animals?
No, it's not that precise, and the researchers readily acknowledge this limitation. It's really difficult to determine precise plant-animal ratios even with DMTA.
Why is that?
Well, partly because modern bear diets themselves are highly variable, both seasonally and regionally. An omnivorous brown bear might eat mostly berries one season and mostly salmon the next. Plus, Different types of hard or tough foods like hard nuts, seeds, or bone versus tough plant fibers or muscle tissue can sometimes produce somewhat similar microwear textures.
So the signal isn't always unique to one food type.
Exactly. So while DMTA tells us a lot about the texture of the food and helps rule out extremes like hypercarnivory, it can't give us an exact recipe for the cave bear's last meal or its typical annual diet breakdown.
But it definitely shifts the picture quite significantly from that old idea of a strict grass eater to a bear that ate a mix, probably leaning heavily on tough vegetation, but definitely not just vegetation. That's a big change in understanding.
A very significant refinement, yes.
Okay, now let's talk about their lives and deaths, particularly in the caves where we find so many of their bones. Where do these bears actually live?
The cave bear had a truly wide range across Europe during the Pleistocene. The fossil finds show they lived all the way from Spain and the British Isles in the west.
British Isles, too. Didn't know that.
Yep, parts of them anyway. Across Central Europe, through Belgium, Italy, Germany, Poland, down into the Balkans, Romania, Georgia, parts of European Russia, and the range even stretched into northern Iran. So a huge distribution area.
Were there parts of Europe they didn't inhabit?
Yes, they were largely absent from areas that were covered by the extensive ice sheets during the main glacial periods. So places like the northern British Isles, most of Scandinavia, and the Baltic countries were generally bear-free zones when the ice was thickest.
Makes sense. And where do we find the biggest concentrations of their remains?
Interestingly, the regions with the largest numbers of cave bear remains found correspond pretty closely with major mountain ranges. The Pyrenees, the Alps, the Carpathians. We find these huge concentrations of bones in caves in places like Austria, Switzerland, northern Italy, northern Spain, southern France, and Romania. Mountainous regions seem key.
Some of these caves are just packed with bones, right? I've heard descriptions of thousands upon thousands of bones in a single cave system. Did this mean they lived in giant herds, all gathering and maybe dying together in these caves?
That was actually a theory that emerged early on, understandably, given the sheer number of bones found in some caves. You hear about sites like Drachenloch in Switzerland or the Odessa catacombs containing remains of literally thousands of individual bears.
Sounds like a herd dying together.
It does, but scientists now understand that these massive accumulations occurred over immense periods of time, potentially 100,000 years, or even much longer in some cases. To account for those vast numbers, you only need an average of about 2 deaths per cave per year, accumulating over that huge timescale.
Okay, so not giant herds dying simultaneously in some catastrophe, but a slow, steady accumulation over millennia, death after death, winter after winter.
Exactly. It's taphonomy, the study of how organisms decay and become fossilized, playing tricks on our perception of time. And a key behavior that led to these massive bone accumulations, specifically in caves, was their specialized use of these spaces.
How so?
Evidence strongly suggests that unlike the more flexible brown bear, which uses all sorts of locations like digging burrows, using cavities under tree roots, or even making open-air dens for hibernation, cave bears seem to have been highly specialized. They appear to have only used caves for hibernation and often for giving birth as well.
Only caves. That's a crucial distinction from brown bears, and it had consequences, I imagine, for their survival, especially if caves were scarce.
It almost certainly did. This specialized reliance on caves likely led to a high winter mortality rate, especially for individuals who failed to find suitable, safe caves for hibernation when winter approached. Unlike a brown bear that could potentially dig a den almost anywhere if needed, the cave bear needed specific underground shelter. They were locked into that strategy.
What were the common causes of death for these bears then, based on what we can see in the fossil record, aside from maybe not finding a cave?
Death during hibernation itself seems to have been very common. It often befell individuals who were already struggling ecologically during the warmer months.
Like who?
Perhaps inexperienced young bears on their own for the first time, sick or injured animals, or very old individuals who just hadn't managed to build up enough fat reserves to survive the long winter sleep without food or water. Hibernation is risky if you're not in peak condition.
And just like us, they seem to suffer from various ailments, diseases, and injuries that we can actually see preserved in their fossil bones.
Absolutely. Paleopathologists, scientists who study ancient diseases, have documented a whole range of health issues from their fossilized bones. It's quite revealing.
Such as?
Things like spinal fusion, bone tumors, dental problems like cavities and tooth resorption, which must have been painful necrosis, which is tissue death. In younger bears, bone infections like osteomyelitis and periostitis.
Wow.
Rickets, likely due to poor nutrition or lack of sunlight in cubs confined to dark dens, and even evidence of kidney stones. There's also skeletal evidence from some sites suggesting they may have suffered from diseases like tuberculosis.
It's striking how many of the same health challenges modern mammals, including us, face were present even tens or hundreds of thousands of years ago.
They were living organisms subject to disease and injury just like any others. And interestingly, another pathology sometimes found, male cave bear skeletons have been found with broken bacula.
The penis bone.
Yes, the bone found in the penis of many mammal species. These were likely broken from intense fighting between males during the breeding season. Male-male competition could clearly be fierce and dangerous.
A tough life indeed, even for the healthy individuals. What about natural predators? Were these huge bears regularly hunted by other large carnivores of the Ice Age?
Healthy adult cave bears were so large that they likely had few natural predators willing to take them on. Perhaps pack-hunting animals like large Ice Age wolves or cave hyenas might have occasionally targeted sick, old, or injured individuals, or maybe young cubs.
Some more opportunistic.
Probably. Cave hyenas in particular are thought to be responsible for some of the disarticulation and destruction we see in cave bear skeletons found in caves. They were likely scavenging the carcasses left behind after the bears died naturally during hibernation.
So hyenas were more of the cleanup crew than active hunters of healthy adults.
Generally, that seems to be the case, but interestingly, complete articulated skeletons of adult cave lions have been found deep within cave bear dens in some sites.
Cave lions. Inside bear dens.
Yes. This strongly suggests that cave lions, Panthera spalea, occasionally entered these dens, presumably to prey on hibernating bears. And sometimes they died in the attempt. Even a hibernating cave bear was clearly a formidable, dangerous target if woken up.
Wow, a battle of Ice Age titans in the dark. That brings us right to the interaction between these powerful bears and humans, which, as you hinted earlier, is where things get really interesting and also where some powerful myths took hold over the years.
Absolutely. There is genuine archaeological evidence suggesting ancient interactions between early humans, including Neanderthals, and cave bears. These encounters weren't always just about, say, humans avoiding bears or vice versa. Sometimes it seems more complex.
Can you give us some examples from the sources? Where do we see clear signs of interaction?
Okay, one site often cited is Rougerdou in southern France. Here, archaeologists found a rectangular pit, seemingly dug by Neanderthals, containing the remains of at least 20 cave bears. And this pit was carefully covered by a large stone slab.
20 bears in a pit.
Yes. And nearby, in another stone-lined pit, lay the remains of a Neanderthal individual, accompanied by various objects interpreted as grave offerings, things like a bear humerus, upper arm bone, a stone scraper tool, and some stone flakes.
That arrangement certainly suggests a deliberate act involving both bears and a human burial. It feels intentional, doesn't it? Perhaps symbolic.
It definitely raises questions. Another intriguing site mentioned is Basura Cave in Italy. In a deep, difficult-to-access chamber, there's a stalagmite formation that's roughly zoomorphic, meaning it vaguely resembles an animal shape.
Okay.
Around this stalagmite, someone had placed small clay pellets, and bear bones were found scattered on the floor nearby. This particular arrangement has been interpreted by some researchers as potentially relating to cave bear worship or ritual by Neanderthals, suggesting a symbolic purpose linked to the natural cave formation and the presence of the bear remains.
So, based on compelling but maybe somewhat ambiguous findings like these, an idea began to take root in the early days of archaeology, the idea of a cult of the cave bear.
Yes, this is the famous myth, or at least what is now widely considered a myth by specialists. It's the idea that Neanderthals, in particular, regularly engaged in complex religious rituals, specifically involving the sacrifice or worship of the cave bear, potentially centered in the very caves where the bears hibernated.
How did this powerful idea originate? Who first proposed it and really pushed it?
The idea was suggested separately by several early excavators, but it's most famously associated with a Swiss archaeologist named Dr. Emil Beckler, based primarily on his findings in the 1920s at Drachenloch Cave in Switzerland.
Drachenloch. That translates to Dragon's Cave, doesn't it?
It does, which already sets a kind of mystical tone, perhaps.
Dragon's Cave, excavated by a scientist finding evidence of ancient bear rituals. That's quite a combination for storytelling. What exactly did Beckler find at Drachenloch that seemed so convincing at the time?
Beckler reported several really spectacular findings that he interpreted as clear evidence of ritual activity. In some of the interior chambers of the cave, away from the main entrance, he found low, mortarless stone walls, only about 10 inches high or so,
Walls built by Neanderthals.
That's what he believed. Behind these apparent walls were accumulations of bare bones, primarily long bones and skulls. He described these structures as unusual and unlike anything typically associated with Neanderthal dwellings or simple shelters, suggesting they had a non-practical, perhaps ritual purpose.
Okay, unusual structures associated with specific bones. What was even more spectacular, the thing people usually remember.
Even more central to the cult idea were what he described as about 6 carefully made dry masonry chests, or cists, essentially box-like structures built from stacked stones.
Stone boxes.
Yes, and these were reportedly full of bare bones. One of these became particularly famous. It was described as being about 3 feet high, covered with a large limestone slab. Inside this specific cyst, Beckler claimed, were several cave bear skulls, all carefully aligned, facing the cave entrance.
That really does sound like intentional placement, doesn't it? A deliberate act of ritual arrangement. Hard to explain otherwise.
It certainly did to Beckler, and to many others at the time. He pointed out that many of the bones in these supposed cysts had tooth marks from large carnivores, suggesting they weren't caches of fresh meat, but perhaps collected remains. The fact that the cysts seemed constructed and were protected by heavy slabs made natural depositions seem highly unlikely in his view.
And weren't there even more striking specific bone arrangements reported? The really weird ones.
Yes, there was a particularly famous, almost iconic example that seemed to absolutely clinch the ritual interpretation for many people. A single bear skull found apparently placed upright between 2 bare shin bones, with a bare thigh bone thrust horizontally through the gap between the cheekbone and the rest of the skull. Beckler felt this couldn't possibly be accidental, especially because the thigh bone seemed to be twisted 90 degrees to fit through the opening. He also reported other skulls found seemingly placed carefully in natural niches between rocks, sometimes covered by slabs, again suggesting deliberate human placement and reverence.
Okay, based on all of this, the unusual walls, the seemingly carefully made chests filled with bones, the aligned skulls, the striking individual bone arrangements like the thigh bone through the cheekbone, it's easy to see why, with the knowledge available back in the 1920s, Beckler and others interpreted these as clear evidence of ritual deposits, evidence of a cult of the cave bear. They seemed to have no practical function and felt profoundly symbolic and spectacular.
And because these findings were so compelling and seemed to offer this incredible glimpse into the spiritual lives of Neanderthals, something people were eager to find, the idea of the cult of the cave bear was quite quickly accepted. It became almost a standard part of the scientific view of Neanderthals for decades. It found support from similar, though often less spectacular, finds reported from other cave sites over the following years, reinforcing the narrative.
But you've called this a myth, so the evidence, while seemingly spectacular on the surface, wasn't as solid as it first appeared. It started to unravel.
Exactly. The idea did have its skeptics from relatively early on, like a researcher named Dr. F.E. Kobe, who was quite critical of Beckler's interpretations even back then. But it wasn't until much later, particularly with the detailed debunking analysis conducted by a Swiss archaeologist named Jean-Pierre Jacquet, whose work began appearing by 1975, that the scientific community really began to systematically grapple with the serious problems in the evidence for the cult.
What were Jacquet's main arguments? How did he challenge Beckler's seemingly dramatic findings?
Jacquet's meticulous analysis focused on 2 main areas of criticism, according to the sources. First, he highlighted major issues with how the data was actually collected and reported back in the 1920s, the archaeological methods themselves. And second, he brought in what had been learned about natural geological and biological processes within caves in the decades since Beckler's excavations. Taphonomy, basically.
Let's start with the methods. How was the data collection flawed back then?
Well, back in the early 20th century, archaeological excavation standards were very different from today. While Beckler was the directing scientist, the actual digging at Drachenloch was often done by local workmen, and Beckler wasn't always physically present to oversee or document every single find directly as it came out of the ground.
Oh.
A crucial example is that famous skull with the thigh bone thrust through it. Beckler apparently wasn't even there when it was found by the workmen. More importantly, Beckler didn't make detailed measured drawings or take photographs of the spectacular finds in situ, that is, exactly as they were found in the ground before being removed. He relied almost entirely on his later descriptions and interpretations based on memory or notes.
So we're relying heavily on his memory and perspective, not on objective visual documentation from the moment of discovery.
Precisely. As Jacquet critically put it, the facts weren't recorded in a raw state, objectively documented for others to interpret independently later. Instead, they were, in his words, already partially interpreted, already masked by a varnish, meaning Beckler's strong beliefs about finding ritual likely influenced how he described and remembered the finds from the very outset. You essentially had to trust Beckler's judgment because he didn't provide the kind of detailed primary record that would allow other scientists to evaluate the finds objectively for themselves.
Was there any evidence that his interpretations might have actually altered his memory or descriptions over time? Like the story got better with telling?
Yes, there's compelling evidence for exactly that, coming from Beckler's own publications. Zecchi pointed out that Beckler's sketch of the famous cyst filled with skulls, published in 1923 shortly after the discovery, differs quite drastically from a drawing of the same cyst that he published almost 20 years later in 1940.
How different.
Very different. The later drawing shows significantly different skull orientations, different numbers and sizes of skulls. The construction methods for the stone cyst itself look different, and even a new dividing wall seems to have magically appeared inside the cyst that wasn't in the earlier sketch at all.
That's a massive discrepancy for such a key piece of evidence. It sounds like he was drawing his idea of the cyst later on, not what was actually there.
It strongly suggests that Beckler was relying on memory, and that his memory was being subconsciously shaped or embellished over time by his interpretation of what he believed he had seen, perhaps making the structure seem more deliberately built and containing more impressive, orderly arrangements in his later recollection because that fit his ritual theory better.
Did the workman's notes, if they existed, provide any different perspective? Did anyone else document what was found?
Yes, crucially. Jackie located and examined the unpublished field notes of T. Nig, the principal workman, who actually did much of the digging at Drachenloch and was present continuously. Nig's notes, written at the time, provided a very different, much more mundane picture than Beckler's dramatic published reports.
Oh, so.
Well, where Beckler spoke of clear walls built by humans, Nig's notes mentioned only seeing piles of stones, and he explicitly wrote that he was unsure if they were intentional structures or just natural accumulations. Where Beckler described carefully made dry masonry chests, and vaguely said about 6 of them, Nig's notes consistently spoke of finding cavities or holes, Noschengruben bone pits, that were full of bones and sometimes covered by slabs fallen from the roof.
Holes and pits, not chests. And Beckler saying about 6 chests also hints they weren't as clearly defined or constructed as he implied later. If they were obvious structures, you'd expect a precise number.
Exactly. That vagueness is telling. So the on-the-ground observations recorded by the person actually doing the physical excavation suggest that the evidence for deliberate human construction was much, much less clear-cut than Beckler presented it in his publications.
Okay, so there were huge problems with the documentation and potential bias in reporting the human construction part. But what about the bones themselves? Even if structures were natural rockfalls, what about finding cavities packed full of bones covered by slabs, or that bizarre thigh bone through the skull arrangement? If humans didn't put them there deliberately as part of a ritual, how can those be explained naturally?
This is where Jacquet's second main line of argument comes in applying what scientists had learned about natural geological and biological processes within caves in the decades since Beckler's time. We now understand much more about cave taphonomy.
Okay.
Caves like Drachenloch are dynamic environments. They fill up naturally over vast periods. Frost action constantly pries rocks loose from the cave walls and roof, creating debris that ranges from small pieces up to huge blocks. These blocks, often flat or tabular in shape, accumulate on the cave floor, sometimes falling among or on top of earlier rock falls.
So piles and layers of flat rocks that might look like walls or crude boxes can form entirely naturally through rockfall and frost weathering.
Yes, that's a very common geological process in alpine caves. Subsequent frost action can even split large fallen blocks horizontally into layers that very closely resemble dry masonry walls. Chagaye pointed out that Nig himself, the workman, initially thought one such pile was a wall, but later realized upon closer inspection it was just a naturally weathered block.
Okay, so the structures could be natural. What about the bones accumulating inside these natural formations or crevices?
This is where the bears themselves come in. Remember, potentially hundreds or thousands of cave bears use this cave for hibernation over millennia. When bears dig out nests or simply move around inside the cave, they push aside loose material bones from previous occupants, smaller rocks, sediment.
Right.
This displaced material often falls or gets pushed into natural crevices and gaps among the fallen blocks already littering the cave floor. This process creates natural accumulations of bones within these cavities among the rocks. And importantly, The rocks then protect the bones trapped inside from further disturbance or decay. Over time, more roof fall occurs, naturally covering these cavities with larger slabs.
Ugh. So the chests full of bones covered by lids that Beckler saw could simply be natural rockfall crevices that got filled with bones through bare activity, and then later naturally capped by more falling rocks. No humans needed.
That's the entirely plausible, natural explanation Jackie provided, which aligns perfectly with geological and taphonomic processes observed in many other caves. He showed how even seemingly striking arrangements could occur naturally through these combined processes.
Any examples of other archaeologists being fooled by this?
Yes, Jackie mentions the famous French prehistorian André Leroy-Gourhan, who described how he was initially completely fooled by a natural circle of cave bear skulls he found at another site. It looked incredibly deliberate, but he realized it was formed simply by bears digging nests and pushing bones around in a small circular chamber with sloping walls. The bear's own activity and the natural scattering created a pattern that looked ritualistic to the human eye, but wasn't.
What about the really specific, improbable-looking case? The thigh bone thrust through the cheekbone. That seems like it has to be more than just chance or bears digging.
It seems highly improbable to us looking at it as a single static snapshot in time. But you have to consider the scale. We're talking about potentially thousands of bones from maybe hundreds of individual bears being moved around, disturbed, buried, re-exposed, and moved again by generations of bears, digging nests over tens or even hundreds of thousands of years that the cave was actively used.
Okay.
Under those conditions, vast amounts of time, huge numbers of bones, constant disturbance by large animals, improbable juxtapositions can actually occur purely by chance, according to the laws of probability. Kobe, the early skeptic, had already pointed this out, noting he'd observed similar cases of strange bone interlacing in pre-human fossil deposits where humans were definitely not involved. It just happens sometimes in nature.
So time and large numbers of bones being disturbed by animal activity dramatically increase the odds of strange, seemingly intentional-looking arrangements happening completely randomly.
Exactly. There's another example cited from Salzwedel Cave in Austria. A cave's bear skull found with a small pebble lodged in its nostril, positioned near two parallel long bones. The original excavator interpreted this as ritualistic object placement, but pebbles and bone fragments were abundant in the surrounding sediment. The juxtaposition, while visually striking, could easily be accidental given the context of how the cave floor accumulated debris and bones through natural processes.
So Zschicke's detailed analysis, really scrutinizing the original reports, comparing them to the workman's notes, and applying a modern understanding of natural cave processes, essentially showed that virtually all the spectacular evidence put forward for the cult of the cave bear either lacked rigorous documentation at the time of discovery, had major internal inconsistencies in the reporting over the years, or had entirely plausible, simpler, natural explanations based on how caves form and how bears behave in them.
That is the inescapable conclusion from Jacquet's work, and it's widely accepted by specialists today. He demonstrated quite convincingly that the foundation of the cult of the cave bear myth was built on flawed reporting of, at best, equivocal evidence, combined with a lack of understanding at the time of natural taphonomic processes in caves. The evidence simply doesn't require invoking complex human ritual behavior. Natural processes suffice.
Given this thorough scientific debunking, which happened decades ago now, why does the idea of the cult of the cave bear still persist? You sometimes still see it mentioned in popular accounts or even textbooks, right?
That's a really interesting question in itself, isn't it? A sort of sociological puzzle within science. There are probably a few key reasons for the myth's surprising persistence despite the solid counter-evidence.
Like what?
First, let's be honest, it's an incredibly spectacular and romantic idea. It taps into a deep-seated human desire to find meaning, spirituality, and complex thought in our ancient ancestors. It captured the public imagination when it was first proposed, and it became deeply entrenched in popular culture through books, documentaries, and museum displays for a long time.
It certainly makes for a much more dramatic and engaging story than rocks fell naturally and bears dug holes nearby.
It absolutely does. Drama sells. Second, the idea is consonant with, or fits nicely alongside, other ideas about Neanderthals that are held by many experts and seem to have better grounding.
Such as?
Well, there is other archaeological evidence that is interpreted by many as suggesting Neanderthal symbolism and potentially religious or ritualistic behavior. Things like potential intentional burials with grave goods at some sites, the use of pigments like ochre possibly for body decoration,
Mm.
findings of eagle talons or shells that might have been used as personal ornaments, or even abstract markings on cave walls or objects at a few sites. For some researchers, the idea of Neanderthals also having bear rituals fits comfortably into this broader picture of Neanderthal cognitive complexity and symbolic thought, even if the evidence for the bear cult itself is weak. It seems plausible in context.
So it fits a broader narrative that many people want to believe or think is supported by other evidence, making the weak bear evidence seem more plausible by association.
Right. It feels like it should be true, given other things we think we know. Also, many physical anthropologists who study Neanderthal anatomy emphasize how biologically similar they were to modern humans, similar large brains, similar physical capabilities. This often leads to the assumption that their lifeways were essentially modern in complexity and therefore likely included spiritual beliefs and complex ritual behavior, just like early Homo sapiens. The cave bear cult idea aligns neatly with this perspective on Neanderthal modernity.
And perhaps archaeologists who don't specialize specifically in this narrow area, say European Paleolithic taphonomy or the specifics of Neanderthal archaeology, including maybe textbook writers who are summarizing vast amounts of information, might accept the idea because it seems to fit with these other seemingly stronger concepts about Neanderthals without scrutinizing the specific detailed evidence and debunking from sites like Drachenloch itself.
That's almost certainly a significant factor. Non-specialists might simply not be aware of the detailed, site-specific debunking work or the strength of the natural explanations. They accept the idea because it's been presented as fact for so long it sounds cool, and it fits a general narrative about Neanderthal capabilities that they already hold. And frankly, specialists who do know the evidence well perhaps haven't always done the best job of effectively communicating just how thoroughly the idea has been challenged and debunked to the wider scientific community and especially to the public.
So, a compelling romantic narrative combined with confirmation bias related to other evidence, plus a lack of widespread understanding of the detailed counter-evidence and the power of natural explanations. It all conspires to keep the myth alive. It's a powerful example of how hard it can be to dislodge a really captivating idea, even with solid science contradicting it.
A very good reminder that even within science, romantic or convenient ideas can sometimes be much stickier than the messy facts.
We've talked about early human art, the life and diet of the cave bear, and this lingering myth around their interaction with Neanderthals. Now let's turn to the final chapter of the cave bear story. Their extinction. What happened to them?
Right. The extinction of the cave bear is another topic that has been a long-standing debate in paleontology. For many years, the discussion primarily centered on two main competing culprits. Was it climate change during the ice ages? Or was it human activity hunting or competition that drove them to extinction?
The classic climate versus humans debate for megafauna extinction. What does the most recent scientific evidence tell us now, particularly from things like genetic studies?
Mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA, studies have been absolutely crucial in shedding new light on this. As you know, mtDNA is inherited just through the maternal line and accumulates genetic changes at a roughly predictable rate. This allows scientists to reconstruct past population sizes and dynamics by looking at the genetic diversity in fossil remains over time.
And what did these mtDNA studies show for cave bears?
They show something really striking. The European cave bear population seems to have been remarkably stable, genetically diverse and large, for a very long period, from about 200,000 years ago right up until about 50,000 years ago.
Was that 200,000 to 50,000 year period climatically stable? Did they have it easy then?
No, and this is the crucial point. During that long window, there were several significant periods of both cooling and warming major climate shifts associated with glacial and interglacial cycles. Big swings in temperature and environment. But these major climatic fluctuations didn't seem to cause a major, sustained decline in the overall cave bear population size, according to the genetic diversity data. They weathered those earlier climate changes relatively well.
That's very interesting. So earlier climate shifts, even major ones, didn't wipe them out or cause a lasting crash. What happened then? When did things change?
The key finding from these genetic studies is that the species numbers began to fall and genetic diversity began to plummet quite abruptly around 40,000 years ago.
40,000 years ago. And what's significant about that particular timing in European prehistory?
Well, that decline started long before the absolute peak cold period of the last major ice age, the last glacial maximum, which occurred much later, around 20,000 years ago. So it wasn't the worst of the cold that triggered the decline? But critically, the decline starting around 40,000 years ago coincides almost exactly with a major event in human history, the onset of the Aurignacian period.
The Aurignacian that's associated with.
That's the archaeological culture associated with the arrival and rapid expansion of anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, across Europe in significant numbers.
Ah. So the cave bear population decline starts right when modern humans are spreading widely across their range.
Yes, the timing is almost spookily precise, and their numbers continue to fall steadily from that point onwards, according to the genetic data. The final extinction time frame sees them vanishing completely by around 20,000 years ago, with the very last known appearances being in potential refugial areas like the Alps around 24,000 years ago.
This timing seems to point a very strong finger away from climate change as the sole or even the dominant factor and squarely towards humans, doesn't it?
That's certainly the conclusion reached by recent large-scale mtDNA studies, like a comprehensive one published in 2019 that analyzed genetic material from cave bear remains found all across Europe. They concluded that human hunting and/or competition for resources played a major role, likely the major role in the cave bear's decline and ultimate disappearance. They stated quite clearly that climate change alone was not likely the dominant factor driving the extinction process.
How exactly would early humans, even modern humans with their Aurignacian toolkit, compete with or hunt such a giant and potentially dangerous animal like the cave bear to the point of extinction?
It was likely a combination of factors, but one of the primary areas of competition identified by researchers is for habitat, specifically for caves.
Caves again.
Yes, as both the resident Neanderthal populations, before Fordycia, and then especially the newly arrived and rapidly expanding anatomically modern human populations increased in density and spread across Europe, they actively sought out and used caves as crucial living quarters. Caves provided vital shelter from the harsh Ice Age climate, security from predators, and relatively stable environments.
And we just discussed how cave bears were highly specialized and appear to have relied only on caves for crucial life stages like hibernation and giving birth. They weren't flexible like brown bears.
Exactly. This specialization made them incredibly vulnerable to this direct competition for prime real estate. They faced a shrinking pool of suitable, safe, unoccupied caves as humans moved in and took over the best spots.
Is there genetic evidence for this reliance on specific caves?
Yes. Interestingly, evidence from Spanish cave bear mtDNA, for instance, shows that each cave system often contained its own unique genetic lineage of bears. This indicates very strong homing behavior. Female bears were highly attached to returning to the same specific cave systems generation after generation for birthing and hibernation.
So they couldn't easily just pack up and find a new cave if humans moved into their traditional den.
It seems not. This strong site fidelity meant they couldn't easily adapt or colonize new sites when their traditional critical cave habitats were taken over by humans. They were losing their essential nurseries and winter shelters.
So humans weren't just competing for, say, the same food resources out on the landscape. They were directly competing for the very shelters these bears absolutely needed to survive the most critical time of the year and to reproduce successfully. That sounds like immense ecological pressure.
It really does. And on top of that direct habitat competition, human hunting has also been implicated as a contributing factor.
Hunting them directly.
While hunting a healthy adult cave bear would undoubtedly have been incredibly risky, even for well-armed modern humans, sick, old, or young bears, or perhaps bears emerging weak and vulnerable from hibernation in the spring, could have been potential targets for organized human hunting groups.
So maybe not the primary driver, but an added pressure.
Exactly. The sources aren't suggesting that humans single-handedly hunted them to extinction in a blitzkrieg fashion, like might have happened with some later megafauna extinctions in other parts of the world. But the idea is that combined with the severe stress of habitat loss due to competition for caves, even a moderate level of human hunting pressure could have been enough to tip the balance and accelerate the decline towards extinction.
Synthesizing all this extinction information, then, the genetic timeline showing decline starting around 40K, the coincidence with modern human arrival, the evidence of intense competition for essential cave habitats, and the possibility of hunting pressure, what's the most supported conclusion today regarding the cave bear's ultimate demise?
While multiple factors likely played some role in making the cave bear vulnerable over the long term, perhaps factors like their somewhat specialized diet on potentially low-quality vegetation, or maybe some inherent biological factors related to reproduction or disease susceptibility, the timing of the significant population decline is key. Starting around 40,000 years ago, aligning so closely with the widespread arrival and expansion of modern humans, combined with the genetic evidence showing this decline wasn't directly tied to earlier, sometimes harsher, climate shifts. All of this strongly supports human activity being the major driving force.
Primarily the competition for caves.
Primarily intense competition for critical cave habitat seems paramount, given the bear's specialization, and possibly exacerbated by direct human hunting pressure. It seems increasingly clear that humans sealed the cave bear's fate, more so than just the changing climate alone acting as the primary executioner.
It's a powerful and perhaps quite sobering reminder that the significant impact humans have had on other species and entire ecosystems stretches back much further than we sometimes think, well beyond the Industrial Revolution or even agriculture.
It seems to be a very early and clear example of human-driven megafauna extinction visible in the European fossil record. Our footprint was becoming heavy even back then.
We've taken quite a journey today, haven't we? From exploring the stunning, often mysterious visual legacy of early human art hidden away in the deep quiet of caves.
Through understanding the life, the long-debated diet, and the imposing physical presence of the powerful cave bear.
And then digging into the complex story of their interaction with early humans, including the rise and fall of that persistent cult of the cave bear myth.
And finally, arriving at the bear's eventual and seemingly human-influenced disappearance from the world.
We've seen how cave art gives us these unique insights into early human expression, maybe their beliefs, certainly their deep relationship with the animal world they inhabited.
And we've learned that the cave bear was a true giant of the Ice Age. Probably not a strict vegetarian as was thought for so long, but more likely an omnivore, perhaps specialized in processing tough vegetation, making it distinct, but maybe not that different dietarily from other bears.
And we've seen a great example of the scientific process in action, how reevaluation, using powerful new techniques like 3D dental microwear analysis and critically scrutinizing old evidence with a fresh perspective on natural processes, has helped to thoroughly debunk a long-standing, quite romanticized myth about a cult of the cave bear, finding simpler, entirely natural explanations for what was once interpreted as profound ritual behavior.
It shows how science self-corrects, even if it takes time. And the story of the cave bear's extinction, once widely debated as purely a casualty of climate change, now appears strongly linked to the arrival and activities of our own species competing fiercely for vital resources like caves, and likely contributing through hunting as well. It demonstrates our species' ability to significantly alter the landscape and the fate of other large animals, even far back in prehistory.
So considering how powerful these recent scientific techniques are, like analyzing those microscopic wear patterns on teeth or sequencing ancient DNA recovered from fossilized bones, how they can dramatically change our understanding of the distant past, it makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other long-held beliefs about prehistoric life or even about human origins and behavior might still be waiting to be challenged or completely overturned by the next discovery or the next technological leap?
That's really the exciting part of paleontology and archaeology, isn't it? Our picture of the past is never truly finished. It's constantly being refined, sometimes radically reshaped by new discoveries and innovative ways of analyzing old evidence. There's always more to learn, always surprises waiting.
And finally, thinking about that complex relationship between early humans and the cave bear, particularly the significant and perhaps largely unintended impact humans ultimately had on this powerful species. What does that tell us maybe about our own species' long, long history of influencing and often pressuring other life on Earth?
Well, it strongly suggests that significant human impact on ecosystems and other species isn't just a recent phenomenon of the industrial age or even the agricultural revolution. It seems to have deeper roots, stretching back tens of thousands of years, perhaps starting almost as soon as Homo sapiens became a widespread, technologically capable, and increasingly dominant force on the global landscape. Our influence is ancient.
Definitely something profound to think about as you look at reproductions of cave art or ponder the lost world of the Ice Age. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.